What's up, Slav? No. No one really knows for sure. Elevate Divrei Elohim Chaim, but this is the story we live by. This is 7th of Nisan, 5786, Wednesday, March 25th. And I have an idea to be on a bunch of podcasts. Yeah, for sure, no doubt. Is this day 88 of this bitch? Tomorrow, where we gotta have a read shit. All right, this is day 8 of this. Is that it? No. 4761. Creation of the earth, creation of the universe, and birth of section of creation of the world, birth of Adam and Chava. When's the creation of the universe? Doug, no. And it's noodle time.
I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome back, where we explore the arcane philosophy. And one of the most difficult aspects in starting to study mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how the right is developed. It's tempting to think that systems in Kabbalah always existed in the form that we have. Why there are these positions is really such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous truly extensive schools of mysticism and Kabbalah. This class to serve as an introduction to mysticism and Kabbalah. From the prophet Israel to the rise of modern century. Of course, this series isn't meant as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully will also enable you to situate developments in Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical cultural context, and hopefully embolden you or obscure. Let me express my gratitude to congregations for allowing me to use one share of esoterica. The entire series of the playlist entering the North introduction to mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be open if you want to watch the entire series. You can find them in that playlist. If you find this series on interesting, check out my other content on esotericism and perhaps the production of free academic and scholarly topics in occultism or prophetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or perhaps a donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of mysticism and Kabbalah. Let's do a little bit of tapping and what we got. part one of this talk about the sacred Zohar, which again, one of the most that I know of. People talk about how phenomenology of spirit by Hegel is intimidating. I don't know, the phenomenon of the spirit, like Fisher Price compared to the Zohar, at least in my opinion, trying to understand it. So as we went through last time, Zohar, Radiance is a mystical Russian literature. It's just a kind of literature that has some kind of Jewish jazz. Not that there aren't Jewish jazz, but it's sort of like medieval Jew literary level. It's where it's something that's completely unrecognizable, but the idea is that if you know the guy that you riff and that he ripped off this riff and that riff came from this riff, you can do it to the Jewish musician story. Much works like that in Jewish literature. And so what we have is sometimes largely a commentary on various Bible, although parts very uneven. Some like Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So we're going to translate it. That verse gets doesn't pages right. So it's very uneven. It's composed of actually several different works combined together, and a minor work in the Zohar, which are self-contained units. These units can be very accessible. The Saba or the Yanuka, the sections that are relatively accessible. It's Nuka, which is only 8 pages or so. It's completely a mystery. It's one of the most difficult texts in all of Kabbalistic history. There are dozens of commentaries written on it. It began to emerge in the 30s in the circle of Iran. Now scholars think there are lots of other hands on this document as well. Though in the traditional world, in the Orthodox world, it's legitimacy because it's according to them, traceable back to the 6th century sage. And what's important about that is from their way of telling the story, right? So it's the academic progressive story is Spain in the area of their own 13th century over the course of about 10 years, beginning around 1270 or so. The traditional story, the Orthodox story, is actually proposed by in the 2nd century, and it was only revealed to the world in the 13th. It was existed the entire time. It just had only been revealed to the world by Moshe Leon and his circle. And some of the core concepts that we dealt with last time are maybe two of the more difficult concepts to grasp. One of those is being soap. And God's most transient state. So this is a way that you can do Kabbalah. Remember that in all the same ways, Kabbalah, the Zohar, to answer a lot of the same kinds of questions that were relevant in medieval era at the time, theologically. And one of those questions is, can a being all magic and all predicates, can we even talk about such a being? Commodity. We can speak in double negatives and say God is ignorant. Right? And so God is infinitely not ignorant, whatever it is, beyond all understanding. Now, obviously, it doesn't end there, because if it started to end there, we would not be here, right? Something that created this world. And so that process, which has happened, is through the sphere of the numerations. I never get how to translate this word. Why, in most cases, you just see that it's left in Hebrew. But it really means something like numeration. It's not the root of Safar, but it's not and so it means something like numerations. And these numerations, there are 10 of them, although we've seen earlier copies had up to 13, and these are transcendental emanations of the gods. Now, that's anyway saying parts of God that flow out of me. So they flow out of that field. That one's different for this, and that one's different because of that. You can see how these things are different because they're different parts of the dynamic process by which God comes into being. And one way of thinking about Kabbalah, imagine Kabbalah is dedicated to the emergence, development, the dynamism, and internal relationship of, and also the relationship of the Jewish people with Jewish law. And we'll see that because what's really important to grasp about the Spirit, the Kabbalah, especially the Hebrew Zohar, absolutely no way of thinking about Israel is and thinking about how Israel interacts with Jewish law, and that interaction with Jewish law has a direct bearing on the spiritual reality. We're going to get to the idea of keeping along tonight. Version of it, and as you'll see, it had nothing before. It had everything to keep people before because the right? That's righteousness, justice, the dynamism of God, and corrects the nature in some way, binds it, and brings it. We covered last time. What composed it, so they're all big complications that we had not solved until the early 2050s, and we're still solving it. The original subject, no bridge that merges out of it down to our world. Questions from my 50. That's the right sense. Not 11, not 9. Yeah. It's a trivial question, but there's the answer and there's no questions. How does it consider you? So that's a different. So you think, and it's there's a working with Alice, always starting with Cheyenne can result in two different meanings of the word. So it's a negation. But there's Cheyenne in Hebrew with the right means nothing. So it's got nothing. But there's a complex concept. Now, what you can do is you can, and we'll see this in a minute with the word heter. But one of the problems is sort of the Hanukkah problems. In the word Hanukkah. But there is a lot going on here too, right? So homophonically, it can sound like the nothingness. It also can sound like without it. And so there's a lot of ideas about the idea of God, which for the Jewish people is Kabbalah. I guess I have a follow-up question. And I've been confident so I just wonder about the pronunciation of the world. Because it may be environment that was distinguishing their pronunciation or if it's like I have yet to be in terms of historians, I really have no idea. My sense is that Sephardic Hebrew is now doesn't make. I don't know know when that distinction was lost. I mean, even at this time of it, talk about people who are making the distinctions back then. They're now in Alec and all the way back in the Bible. So my guess of whom motion wasn't making distinctions, but right, words don't make a distinction. I am the same. Do pronounce those. Those are right. That's a different one. Well, I'll stop. One's a voice for personal friction. If you do pronounce it differently, the pun doesn't work. They like that pun. They were identically like the fact that Hebrew been spoken on. Yeah, and I know this also required me doing something about how Rabbi Rothschild was spoken necessarily. So my sense is that because of that pun is possible to them, and no one criticizes the pun, it must be something that's the two letters. I guess, but I'm part of it. Rabbi. Other questions? Folks who have some Kabbalah does this. This is the class what's going to come up. And I've put off. Don't want to get this because this image that has locked in people's mind all of Kabbalah. About 10 zeros in the tree of Kabbalah is much more skated because even this whole thing you see right now is an ideal alignment. This alignment will never happen in our lifetime unless the Messiah comes. In the Zohar, they are very clear. The writers of the text are very perfectly balanced vision of what the Spirit are. And it's very clear that's not the case. So what you're seeing here of the Spirit, not as they are, ever have been, ever in all of the scriptures, but as they will be in the Messianic era, right? So Yom HaShem, when Hashem's name is one, right? When everything is not until then. I just want to stir up people's minds that this was the spirit of the in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar like this. Because if they did, our world would look very different. Because our world and the eternal world in the Zohar mirror each other. Our world is out of whack. If anything is bad to you today, anything is bad to any fault, or not. So the thing that I just want to keep, I want to pound this drum. The thing I want to pound about this drum is that this is an ideal representation of the spirit. They're always in an inner dynamic relationship, polyamorously in relationship with God's self. All the various people, entities within God's self are always out of whack. So what is it out of whack? Let's go through this. At the top, let's open the Ein Sof. Everything emerges in Ein Sof. So from up above here be nothing. And yet here was everything. Ein Sof is up here. And then the first thing to emerge was the crown of God. The first apparent thing of God. So this thing is the inner glory of God. It's the first moment of God's will. Because in order for there to be, there must be intentionality. And that inner intentionality of God, the first stir means this part of you, have folks ever woke up before their alarm, before your alarm goes off? The thing that makes you get up before the thing that's not even conscious to you, what's like for your lawn. It's that something arose in you, stirring you into consciousness. Before, imagine this is the thing that gets up before God's alarm goes off. Right? It's not conscious. It's not a thing. It's a completely unknown thing that stirs you to get up 1 second before your alarm. But something stirred inside you, your corporeal consciousness. And that first thing is you must have happened. We can logically fix it because things are here. Keter is completely unknown. Right? It's a science. Because it's a kind of knowable nothingness. So it's an unknowable nothingness. Keter is a knowable nothingness. Now, in order to wake up, when you wake up, you immediately come to. So I've ever had this sort of surprise wake up, your consciousness happens to you like a flash. Everything's like Google Map, your Google comes up, your calendar, and email. Flash of everything you have to do for the day. That consciousness, that's completely just a flash of everything that you know all at once. Now, obviously, you can dwell in cluster because everything that you know coming at you all at once is a gestalt. Parse things out. You have to analyze think right. Now I have to get up, I have to get the kids up, write this, do this, do this, do this. Your consciousness has to be compartmentalized in analytical structures. That certification of God's consciousness is behind. It's God's intelligence, or God's understanding, right, as opposed to God's wisdom. So, flash, and then it's analytical. That flash. And you can see how these happen in brief moments. They're not like long periods drawn out. They're like logical inductions. We'll come back to the odd in a minute. Dots over here. Sphere. Immediately flowing from Mina, we have Chesed is the immediate moment where if you're doing it right, you imagine, you know everything you do in the day. What are the first things that you do? Take care of yourself. You know you got a lot to do. What's the first thing you do? Make some breakfast. Take care of yourself. This is Chesed. Loving kindness. Pure loving kindness. Stay in loving kindness. You're never going to get done. You can't just love yourself all day. And how do you do that? You judge yourself. Send an email. Don't email so bad. This guy is bothering me on email. So what? You have to move out. Who cares what he says? Judgment. Judgment, when it's unchecked, Chesed, you're just pure judgment. That's terrifying. Because pure judgment, unchecked by any loving kindness, vengeful rage. In the Kabbalah, tonight, this is where evil comes from. Imagine check judgment that flows out of the evil tonight. Now, when all of these things are in balance, all these upper spheres are in balance, that forms the most imaginable. The balance between justice perceived, analytical thought, insight, between the divine nothingness. That is Tiferet. It's the perfect balance of everything. Okay. Judge, love, therapy is the womb of creation. Every balance in the womb. From Tiferet, we have Netzach and Hod. Netzach and Hod are strength. Don't get enough attention, but it's really interesting. This is the fact that you have to test. When you get perfectly balanced, I don't know about you, but folks that were going to the gym goals, or you reach your whatever goals you have, and you want to stay there, you can't stay there. You have to continue to grow. Next up is the part that continues to grow. It's pushes you further than you can go. A little more inward, right? If you think you can only grow, you have nothing but blind ambition, well, that's unbalanced. You need to check it. What do you check it with? You turn it inward. In many ways, Netzach is the principle of God's extrovertedness, and Kod is the principle of God's introvertedness. Those come together in Yesod. Yesod is something like absolute divine unity. Comes together in Yesod, and this is God assessing. It's balance between God's exuberance and interiority. I'm a very introverted person. I know an extroverted person. Imagine the two of us combined. Very curly beard, more hair than I have. Divine, balance of the divine is balance. Match to it. The vagina of the divine. The core vagina of the divine. And Yesod and Shekinah in upon each other. You must think about things like 3 dimensions. Folding, close out. Here's Shekinah. You can see here it's open. It's open at the bottom. Mark. This is where in the world of Malchut. Malchut is kingship. I think better than kingship. Shekinah is how we live God in this part of our in this part of reality. Only really guys. So we are in the what do we do with the Torah? With the Torah, we'll always female. Israel's always female, but in some ways, this divine procession and by following Jewish law, that idea is not a couple. It's not passive feminine. Shekinah is also receiving, but very importantly, check processing back up. And everything down here is mirrored back up the entire structure. This is not what's the problem with the last time. How do you bridge the finite? You start from the infinite recess. So you're above Keter. There's dynamic moments flowing down all the way to Shekinah, all the way back up. That procession continues as long as it must continue until everything's balanced. And that balance, achieving that balance, is the goal of balance. That's it. It's not your denial of your ego. It's not your obliteration. It's not you being whatever. Because it's not thought about in Jews. It's not about you. This text imagines Israel, corporate law Israel. The thing here that's at work is the rebalancing and structure of reality. That, to the Zohar's mind, read the Zohar, is achieving metaphysical, cosmic, interior balance. That's a metaphysical thing, physical things, all those things are. So, this is the image you've seen. This image I'm sure you've seen of this road. That is the 2-minute, 3-minute explanation of what's going on there. Now, again, what I want to try to home about this is that this is never balanced. It's never balanced. But Because if it were balanced, right, we would not live in a world in which there was suffering and violence. Now, it's not to say that in the perfect world there won't be some kind of violence. There might be all kinds of violence. It just might be that balance is matched by justice. Because, again, the writer of the Zohar doesn't imagine that in the perfect world the death penalty will go away. It just imagines that it will execute constantly. Law, which is the perfect example of law, according to the Zohar, there are death penalty cases. There's 4 modes to death penalty: beheaded, burned, strangulation. So the Zohar imagines that people will be executed, even in the perfect world. Their execution will be just. It will be part of the Gevurah, punished correctly. So, again, don't put your liberal, progressive, woke ideas on the Zohar. Just don't do it. That's not the way to imagine the world. What's important is to imagine the way you should imagine the world. If the Torah, the laws of Moses by God, are how this came out. Come back to that. Let's talk about the Shekinah. Sorry for the text being so small on this slide. I'm not sure why. It's my fault. That's the text on my slide. The word for Shekinah is actually coming from the word for to dwell or to settle. The Shekinah is the thing about God, the part of God, the aspect of God that settles amongst the world. It's the part of God that exists at our register of reality. And this idea has a couple of different historically important verses that I just want to mention. The first is that you may know this, but you may not. The earliest instances of the discussion of Yahweh, Yahweh had a wife. There are really early images of Yahweh actually having a consort or wife, and this being Asherah. The earliest depiction we have of Yahweh actually depicts this being as having had a wife. And so early on in the Jewish literature, there's always a very difficult relationship with the idea that God can have a wife. And one way of dealing with that was to condemn everything dealing with femininity, everything dealing with the feminine aspect of God, especially Asherah, and conscious or worship of Asherah. The other thing is good old classic Freudian terms. What that means is that there are all kinds of aspects of God that sort of get divinized. Particularly God's wisdom. If you've ever read Proverbs, there's a long section where wisdom becomes almost a kind of feminine God, where she's described as perfect, beautiful, alien woman, Shachara. But there's an idea that wisdom can be personified, maybe even deified, and that idea is going to come into working so far later. Also, the idea that God has a kind of presence in the world that's distinct to some level from God. That God can appear as the angel of the Lord, or God can appear as a fire coming down the mountain, or dwelling in the Mishkan, or the pillar of fire during the day. There is an idea that the world can be different than God somehow. The possibilities of the reality of God. And what ends up happening by the time of the Babylonian Talmud is that this term is sometimes referred to as Shekinah. This is the appearance of God. The word means presence or indwelling. And while the noun here is feminine, the feminine gender in Hebrew, it's never the case in the Talmud that they think of the Shekinah as a woman, feminine gender, woman gender. But they just think of it as a grammatically feminine noun, not as a woman. So as you might imagine, with the Zohar, part of what the Zohar is going to do is the Zohar and the Sefer Bashir are going to be mystical, not in the way of reading things in very elaborate, very ambitious ways, they'll do that too, but how they read things very literally. And it says the Shekinah, when Shekinah is in the feminine gender, it must be feminine, full stop. It just is. It's not just a grammatical reality, it's an ontological reality. And we'll see in the Talmud that it is the case that there often is bridal language used. So, for instance, one of the things that you may know is that there are a couple of books in the Bible that rabbis were always very nervous about. One of those was Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes. Another one of those books that the Bible was very concerned about was Esther, never mentions God. And another one of those books the Bible was very concerned about was the Song of Songs, because it's about teenagers having sex. And that seems weird. So the rabbi said, look, it's not about teenagers having sex, it's about the relationship between God and Israel. Well, if God is the masculine partner in that relationship, well, what does that leave Israel? It leaves Israel the feminine partner. Well, some further speculation said, well, no, it's not Israel being feminine, it's another part of God. And so we have this idea developing over time, and there being an entire long series of lectures development of the Shekinah. What we see that over the 1,000 years, the concept goes from being a grammatical construct with an element of God living in the world to being an ontological, metaphysical construct with actual God being feminine. So there's a lot of complicated things going on in that. Also, what's worth pointing out here, and I don't want to go into this too long, is that in the old Gnostic mythologies, the mythologies that developed primarily in texts like John and some other texts as well, and the Nag Hammadi library and the larger Gnostic world, the Gnostics, as you may remember, were groups and Christians and pagans who believed that knowledge, as opposed to faith, liberates you from this world. But if you knew certain kinds of things about this world, you could escape from it. Knowledge saving you as opposed to faith saving you or belief saving you. In the Gnostic worldview, there was a divine emanation scheme, which is somewhat similar to what we'll talk about later, similar to the Platonic stuff, Middle Platonic stuff, where God flows out of God itself, and at the very last rung of that process, there's disaster. And that very last wrong is an entity called Sophia, wisdom, very similar to what you find in Proverbs. And Sophia wants to create something without reference to the divine world, and she's creating an abomination called the power. Chaos style. And this the text described it as a living abortion. Something really truthful about that idea. But it's alive and not alive, it's ignorant, blind, chaotic, and it creates a higher world than yourself. It's insanity. And that world is our world. Our world is the entity creating it. And the world is just a prison for us. It's a giant trap. And so what ends up happening, not to rehearse this too much, is that there seems to be some good evidence to say that elements of that kind of mythology survive. And you use them a lot more than it survives in Christianity. We see similar elements of that in the sacred right here, which describes wisdom, as a maiden from a far off land or a maiden from a foreign land cast into our world. So we think there may be connections all the way back to the late classical world and this Gnostic worldview, which again that term is a bit problematic in a lot of ways. But we think that maybe emerged from that worldview. The last thing I want to say about the origins of the Shekinah are two things. One is we're living in 13th century Spain. If you know anything about courtly culture, idolizing remote women is all the rage in troubadour literature. It's all about the ideal woman who's completely virginal and you have to sing all these praises to her, but you can never have her. This courtly literature is a huge part of Spanish literature, both also at the troubadour level. And so there's an enormous outpouring of infinite longing for the unapproachable woman. And so we have that happening at the literary level, at the musical level, popular level. Also, the other thing I should point out here that's also very important is at the same time that's going on in the Jewish world, the Marian cult in the Catholic world in Spain is also happening. The adoration of the Virgin Mary is not always a big deal, but now that really began in Spain, and the adoration of the Virgin Mary was very, very popular, and so there's some reason to believe that the adoration of the Virgin Mary, that the Shekinah development of that may have been a Jewish response to larger hegemonic culture, where the Jewish response was, look, they're trying to convert a bunch of us, and what's really popular, this whole Virgin Mary thing, well, we got that. We don't even need studying Virgin Mary, we got God. God does all the stuff, cool stuff Virgin Mary does. And so if you read this over carefully, a lot of the stuff it says about Shekinah looks a lot like the kind of stuff that developed in the Marian cults. And so unsurprisingly, the minority culture is mirroring a very sort of hybridity way. Baba, they're hybridizing the Marian cult and developing a hybridized version of it. And that hybridized version, leaning on their tradition, is what there's a lot of debate about that, but I find it to be a very convincing analysis, especially when you take some post-quantum study, apply that stuff. I think it's a very compelling point about the origin of Shekhinah being something that's developed to respond to spiritual culture, but rarely in song, but also again, we use the word culture not to diminish their religiosity. It's just we use the word religion to use the word culture. It's in the Zohar that the Shekhinah becomes an explicit and feminine aspect of God. In the Sefer here, we have echoes of this, we have murmurs of this, but it's in the Zohar that it's no doubt that there is a definitively feminine aspect of God, and at some level that's the aspect of God that human beings feel. And this 10th Sphira, Malchut, the world of angel, the world of kingdom, is often tied to Rachel, as you probably know is associated with mourning. So the world of Malchut is associated with black, Rachel. All of the various spirits are associated with colors, with targets that are all kinds of the body, you probably saw the diagram, all kinds of things associated with what the writer of the Zohar does is something very interesting. When they want to find where the Shekhinah is, they will rely on the fact that any time you see the word et in Hebrew, et, as you may know, for folks who know some Hebrew, et is a direct object marker in Hebrew. It doesn't translate it. For instance, at the very beginning of Genesis, I have the very first verse of part of the first verse of Genesis here, right? Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'aretz. So Bereshit bara. So in the beginning, he made, namely God, what? S. Et. Correct. Et. God created Et. Now, to read this grammatically correctly, you would say, in the beginning, he created God, Elohim, God. Et, direct object marker. What did God create? Hashemayim ve'aretz. God created the heavens and marker. So in the beginning, God created the heavens. No, because the Torah would never just throw words around. So the et here, Aleph Tav and Aleph Tav, cannot just be superfluous. They can't just be random direct object markers. What are they? Shekhinah. The Shekhinah. And so they say, no, this is the world of the Shekhinah, and this world perhaps is the world of the Sefirot, and then after the Shekhinah is Hashemayim ve'aretz. The heavens come first, then Shekhinah dwells in the Haaretz. And so what we have here, right, what we have is a very public reading of the Bible, where a direct object marker, that is not a direct object marker. It's the creation of the emanation rather of Shekhinah into the heavens, and then further the Shekhinah into the earth. The world of they make a lot of big deal about this. The Zohar is all about this. It means that Shekhinah dwells in heaven and she dwells in the earth. And that's in our world. And notice we dwell in our world. Elohim. Right? Elohim and certainly doesn't bara. Because bara is creation with no subject of creation. Or creates, I would say. What creates? Nothing. Right? In the beginning, nothing created. What did nothing create? Elohim. Sefirot, and what flowed from them? Shekhinah, and where Shekhinah? Hashemayim ve'aretz. For the Kabbalist, Zohar, they see the entire structure of the Sefirot echoes the first 6 words of the Bible. Again, not because they're reading things out of it that are unusual, but rather because they're reading it incredibly literally. So, what's fascinating about this is that, again, it shows you something about how the Zohar works in terms of Kabbalistic hermeneutics and also why these texts are difficult, because if you don't read Hebrew very well, you don't remember very well, and this is all basically lost. So what's going to happen is that the world of Malchut is joined with the eternal world of what is called Yichud, unification, marriage, and what's going to happen according to the world of our world is that the task of our world is to take the Shekhinah to exile, the idea that God's presence in exile is found in the Talmud. When Israel goes into exile in Galut, so does Shekhinah go into the Galut. And our task is to reunify the Shekhinah, which is in Galut, in this world, this eternal world, and as we get to Jewish law, it's the case that we remarry Shekhinah remarry the upper world, everything is like a giant bond, and it all clicks into place, and ultimately everything's resolved. The imbalance is resolved. Now, why does that imbalance happen? The Zohar never says. And as we get later on, next time, is to Lurianic Kabbalah, we will learn why, according to Lurianic Kabbalah, why the primordial imbalance happens. We're going to get into the big drama about why it happened next time. So what ends up happening here is that we are plunged into matter, and we have to return back by redeeming matter. Now, what's different about, for instance, Kabbalah and maybe Gnostic texts is that nothing wrong with matter. It just needs to be redeemed. Just like a coupon. There's nothing wrong with coupons. But a coupon is to redeem. And so the idea is that you redeem matter. Not that you escape it, not that you betray it, not that you get rid of it. It's not bad or evil, but it's a need of redemption. How does that happen? It happens through this process of regionally unified with the eternal world. Even what happened in the Garden of Eden, that went awry, it's not really clear what went awry, is there's some indication, at least in some sections of the Zohar, that what ended up happening was that Adam became so infatuated with this eternal world that he abandoned his material life. Adam was actually too pious. So notice this is a complete version of the Garden of Eden story. In the Garden of Eden story, it's that in the original version, to sexual. And that version is that they committed sex or whatever, did some kind of thing or whatever it was, in that he focused too much on their body and messed them up. No, in the Zohar version, Adam is actually too fixated on the Shekhinah, and his partner, Chava, wife, physical world, feels abandoned by him. She's not satisfied by him. She's not he's not doing his duty, and that allows her to be seduced by the snake. The traditional version is all the blame put on her. She gets tricked by the snake. But in the Zohar version, one version of the Zohar version is his fault. He's a negligent husband. But he's so focused on the eternal world that he's not focused on the physical world, which is his world. This world are a world. The Zohar is very clear about this. You cannot focus on the spiritual world. You cannot. On a monk, there's no mystical Kabbalistic monks. You are obliged to deal in this world. It's only by dealing in this world that you can actually deal with this world. So again, how does this get fixed? Well, it eventually comes and it gives us the Ten Commandments, it gives us Torah, and it's by combining spiritual and physical. Again, the Zohar is all about balance. Combine the spiritual and the physical, and we begin to find light again. Adam focused too much on the world of the eternal. Other patriarchs focus too much on the world of the terrestrial. The idea is we must combine them to one another. And this becomes incredible. The language here is always the prayer section. The language is the very home sexual language. That sex is part of this observance. You're obliged to have be fruitful and multiply. Again, it imagines that, of course, it's imagining a very hyper heteronormative way of thinking about this. Although I think at the edges of the text, there's a lot of interesting homoeroticism and a lot of weird stuff that one can do with the Zohar in a way that I think is very, very rich. Not that I think it's very rich. Very people have done incredible things with the Zohar that has shown this text is hyper heteronormative. So at the same time, many of the ideas it commits itself to don't conform. It can't logically. So there's all kinds of cool studies to show that those categories can break down pretty rapidly and get a little bit under the hood or under the sheets of what's going on. The Zohar is a lot more happening here. But the idea ultimately is that there's a sense sacred between Israel and Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah and Israel, separate and by the observance on the Jewish law as a kind of ritual act of intercourse. The observance of law is kind of thought of as a kind of intercourse. That as you do the law, you're having spiritual intercourse with the divine. Because it's only because Jews have a covenant with God, a marriage contract with God, that they can do the things they do. The only similar thing to that custom is sex. It's only by having a certain kind of relationship with a certain kind of person that you have sex with them. Well, because God has this relationship, then it must be the case that all of these 613 rules are fundamentally kind of intercourse with the divine. So it's long, all incredibly erotic terms, and so this is very much like Shabbat. Next time, Shabbat becomes incredibly and Kabbalah is core observance. In fact, if you've ever done Kabbalah Shabbat, which I imagine most people in this class have, Kabbalah Shabbat completely invented observance by to re-enter the marriage between God and Israel every single day. Every son left up to the reason why he sins is because she gets married. She's every week to the Shabbat bride. And that idea directly back to Zohar becomes so ingrained in Jewish customs that it's now a service that basically every Jew does every week. In fact, I would say even liberal Jews, if they only go to shul once a week on Friday nights, they're doing the higher accounts, they're doing the sacraments of marriage as it is understood here in now, this hyper focus on sex is probably a dig at the Catholics. One of the things that Judaism did have going for it is Catholicism didn't. Catholicism was really down on sex. I don't know if you know this about people. They like sex. People love sex. It's a big thing. They like it. They get down and pay for it, sell it. It's a big part of the internet. It may be the reason why the internet is big. We may just keep piggybacking on like video games and sex. So I think that's actually true. It's probably we piggyback on military intelligence, Pornhub, and I think how video games and military intelligence are on the same thing too. Could be right here. It's very much the case that part of this whole attitude towards sex is very heteronormative and very much into the marriage environment. But it's also the case that this is probably big Christianity, because Christianity is all about celibacy. It's all about the perpetual virginity of Mary. It's all about the fact that Jesus and Paul were never married, so never had sex. And the Jews at the time, the rabbis at the time, were like, yeah, that sucks. Sucks for them. They got to be celibate. Mary never got to have sex, or she only had sex with God, kind of, or whatever. And Jesus and Paul never got married. Even average rabbi down the street doing some Kabbalah gets laid at least once a week. And your God never got laid? Because your God. Your main prophet, Paul, like, hated his body, hated having sex. Something wrong with him. You ain't got that kind of problem. So, I think also a lot of this hypersexual stuff going on in the Zohar is also relationship physical body. But again, part of it about having your human community is sex. It's great to have sex. In fact, you're obligated to have sex. You gotta have sex. But know that your sex is part of this mystical thing, and it's very purposeful. It's strange. So you're also Now, if there's good stuff, sex, also bad. And evil, and Kabbalah, is thought of as part of God. It's called the Siddur Achra, the other side. Now, what's important to know about the history of evil in the Jewish world and in the Christian world, in the classical theology of the Muslim world, it's thought of as basically a kind of purification. But evil was something like cold. Cold is just a light. Darkness is just a lack of light. Darkness is nothing on its own. Cold is nothing on its own. And so, because these things are just negations of something else, they don't really exist. So, evil is just a non-existent place where God is. It's a part of God that rebels against God. It's part of your heart, according to Augustine, against God, into your heart, the divine grace, and that emptiness inside your own heart. God-shaped hole, that's and because Satan is just a pure rebellion, Satan is pure indication. Well, this is true of Neoplatonism, it's true of lots of different traditions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Rabbis of the Kabbalah, especially in Sicilian Kabbalah, Zohar said, no, evil's real. And it's not hard to imagine why a medieval Jew would be very convinced of the reality of evil. Evil was part of their world. They didn't face pogroms in Spain. They knew about pogroms. They didn't face annihilation the way they did in Germany. The creeping reality of the Reconquista, no Jew in their right mind in 13th century Spain had any pretension that once they were done with the Muslims, they were not going to come to the Jews. Evil was real. So we're not going to have this philosophical crap. See, we're not going to have this idea that evil's not real. Evil's real. If evil's real, it must come from God. Everything comes from God. Everything flows from Himself. So where does it come from? Well, think back to this image, and we talked about this a minute ago. There flows like a Pokemon. Pokemon flows into the eye. Again, you can imagine sort of a rush of water, a rush of light. As it rushes out, it's caught by Pokemon, and it rushes back over to the eye, it's caught by Enoch. It rushes over to Chesed, it's caught by Chesed. But as Chesed rushes over to Gevurah, you can't catch it all. There's so much power flowing now that it hits Gevurah, and it's like a bowl when you pour water into it, it sort of runs down the side. The main image of Zohar, the image of Zohar love better. The other one is an image of a blacksmith. As you forge an item in a blacksmithery, right, a smithery, you pound on that hot metal. And the only way you're going to get a fork or a knife or a spoon or a sword or whatever is you pound it. You have to pound that metal. There's no way you can shape the unformed metal without pounding on it. As you pound on it, sparks fly out. Shards of metal fly out. Dross pours out. It's an inevitable part of creating something. When you create something, it throws off sparks. And those sparks are burning and dangerous. And they're dross. They're wreckage. In the Zohar, that is wreckage, that's dross, those sparks, that excess of pure Gevurah, pure rage, righteous rage. You can imagine what is happening is that it flows out of Gevurah and it cooks the entire backside of all of the other spirits, like a kind of evil coating of darkness, a kind of hatred, rage, inversion of each one of these. As it coats the backside of something, that becomes another reality. And that other reality is the world outside. You know, like inverted, evil, negative images we wrote. So horrifying, the first three don't even survive. They're so absolutely evil that the will of them, they are annihilated. They can't even exist. They're so they implode their own absolute negativity, black hole or something. But the other seven, the first three implode and vanish. The last seven, they continue to exist. Oh, I should say this about Enoch, or about God. Sorry. In some schemes of this, you may see another sphera here, another sphera right here. It's called Da'at, that means knowledge. The reason why there might be another sphera here is because there because it's so not something out there that's real. You need something else to pin up, and the odds become that kind of pseudo. It gets really complicated. We can't get into it for the class, but it ends up being a balance in the completely nothingness of Keter of Pokemon Arena, the balance of these three, just like these are balanced here, these four are balanced in Ferret, you get a balance here in Dot, but also you'll see it drawn like a dot circle. At any rate, that cross is thrown off and that becomes evil. For the zone, it's a necessary aspect of reality, and you can't get rid of it by anything other than refining it. You can't get rid of it except for by refining it. You have to subject it to purification. And how does one purify it? One purifies it by the process of shift. Now, as we get to later on, what's important to know about this is the zone doesn't imagine evil as inherently bad. It imagines it as an excessive something that has to be tempered. And you temper it by rectifying, by fixing it. And in the later luring light couple attributes later on, this becomes a shard of hope and demonic angels that rule the world of darkness. And that world of darkness creep into our world. And one of the lines in the book of Genesis that the Zohar really harps on is it talks about the 70 mighty kings of God. And this is a throwaway line in Genesis 20. It seems like that these lines don't have anything. It's a bunch of kings that died. No, not the Zohar. They're the primordial evil worlds that exist. And we have to deal with them by rectifying. And the thing that the Zohar is most worried about, the thing that works on the most more than anything else, is the same kind of thing that Catholics are on. And that's masturbation. My God, the Zohar is glorified in sexual sense, especially masturbation. And there's the idea that if wastes seed, then that seed spent semen that's lying there on it becomes like more and more evil. The world gets more and more imbalanced, more tilted to the side of the other side. Also, the uncleanliness of menstruation is the mortifying world. In fact, so much so that because of the primordial sin of Eve, she is the sort of representative of evil in the world, because her menstrual blood is like a dross thrown off by her menstrual cycle. And the menstrual blood is just like dross thrown out of the position where creation didn't occur, and was born again. But the idea is the blood flowing out of her mirrors the dross thrown off in the process of creation, whereby she is not. And there's a ton of interest in evil. The Zohar abounds in discussions of evil, and probably heavily on discussions of evil coming out. And your Kabbalists of Castile are very interested in evil as the manipulation of the side. And so there are tons and tons of things about evil, especially anti-Gentile stuff. So we have to be very honest. The Zohar hates Gentiles. Overwhelmingly Gentiles corrupt, evil, dangerous, bad. This is not an ecumenical text. Any stretch of the imagination, not reading this text and imagine this text is anything that says about Gentiles. Very negative. And so, again, are you not surprised? Again, imagine being Jewish in 13th century Spain. Do you have positive interactions with non-Jewish people, with Christians? Not really. So it's unsurprising that they're going to have a pretty negative attitude. Now, does that mean that Zohar is inherently bigoted? It might. It might mean that it's a bigoted text, especially if you take those same attitudes and apply them to non-Jewish people now. Yeah, it's going to result in you being real bigoted, mystical bigoted, of the worst forms of it. So we have to own the fact that stuff's in there and deal with it as Jews. If you want to study the Zohar and study the Kabbalah, you have to understand that there are big non-Jewish people there, and you have to deal with them, and whether it's good to deal with them. And so they can lean on that as a historical characterization. Rabbi Rothschild himself was head by the Romans, the Roman colonial project in India, and also anti-Gentile stuff Talmud says one that Gentiles things just in common that stuff's terrible. Non-Jewish people are a huge life. That's unconscionable. It's there. It's in the Talmud. Zohar. You ignore it. Now, can any Semites pick up all that stuff and claim that the Talmud is racist? Gentile people can do the same thing about the Zohar. They don't know the Zohar. Just so you anti-Semites know. You can also they don't know that. Much of the Zohar is very complex. Numerous demons in Zohar. And that's not surprising because you have the exact same kind of demonological stories flourishing in Christianity at the time. This is the exact same time that you get a rapid rise in demonology in the Christian world as well. And so, again, unsurprisingly, Jewish demonology developing and facing one another at this time period. And it basically gives rise to this kind of possession, exorcism, Judaism that began to emerge in the late 16th Really important about the Zohar is it's incredibly conservative, which is to say it wants to defend rabbinic tradition, very red rabbinic tradition, there's no interest in sort of other rabbinic tradition. Now it interprets things sort of solidly avant-garde way, but it's very worried about philosophy. Because philosophers are dangerous people. I don't know, we're dangerous people. That's how they kill us from time to time. And one of the things that worry the writers of the Zohar is that the philosophy, the Jewish philosophy, like my mom, weird stuff in the Torah is just symbolism. It's just metaphor. Really, God is really concerned about being reasonable, being rational, being a good person. And if you understand the Bible in more terms than that, you're probably engaging in some kind of stupid idolatry. But you just don't know better than philosophy. The danger with that, folks, is that Jews are facing an overwhelming pressure to convert at this time in 13th century. Very strong pressure. They can be given land and title and deed. They can be given all kinds of encouragement to convert. Conversion is very attractive. And again, forget, we're not 190 years out, 200 years out from the Muhammad in 1492. The pressure is already on for Jews to convert. And as you can imagine, a wealthy Jewish doctor, a wealthy Jewish poet, a wealthy Jewish rabbi who's had a lot of pressure to convert, if he's a Maimonidean and believes that really God a metaphor and those kind of metaphors, and hell, you gotta stick your neck out for a bunch of metaphors. If Jesus and God and Moses and they all kind of come out the same wash, you get to keep your job and flourish, you get new land, you best believe those people convert. Not because they hated their religion, because they were educated, that they can say, look, I can worship my God inwardly, and still believe in all that I believe in. I can pray in the church. Because praying in church is to get title. So why not? Because you're solid. That's why. Stupid, dangerous, bad Jew. Why? Because the very way that you react. So the very way that God engineered reality is that you reverse engineering by following the Torah. You have to understand what important topics are. The Torah are the reasons for the commandments. The commandments in the Torah are not random. They're not made up things. When God says put the bell on, when God says we're this, when God says honor the Sabbath this day, on this day, not Sunday, when God says do God's not telling you this is a roadmap, not just a roadmap of society, but a roadmap of the reconstruction of reality. This is how you fix the world. And not only that, God's telling you not just to follow the rules, but you should follow them. God tells you to follow the rules because God follows them. God kept Shabbat. God puts on the test. God puts on towels. God does everything that you're supposed to do. This is imitation today. The task is not for you to do a bunch of rules. The task is for you to follow the rules because God does those rules. And insofar as God does those rules, and it's only by doing that, only by following the Jewish law scrupulously, especially the rules that make no sense. It's only by following those rules that make no sense that you have any chance at all of balancing out the rules of the road. The only way you can do this, the only way that the world would fit is by Jews being servant Jews. So again, to drive this point home, the Kabbalah is not liberal, hippie Judaism. The Kabbalah is the most radically, legally conservative Judaism you can imagine. And why? Because the esoteric meaning of is that they are actually part of the recreation, renovation of the world, the renovation of the world, reparation. It's only by following the Jewish law scrupulously as possible. This is actually the parts that don't make sense. So, the same way that God created the world, God mandated holidays, and mandating those holidays is not just Jews, it's not just Russia trying to reform it. These are divinely mandated temporal structures in which one can correct the world in a very specific way at a time. You can't bring the real day of the year, special power that day, and the Zohar loves very minor holidays. Sometimes you travel to Israel, ask what Jewish holiday you're trying to weed out people. You always want to mess with them, right? Say, yeah, my favorite holiday is the most obscure holiday ever. The Zohar says, Shmini Atzeret is the most important holiday. No more important holiday. Yom Kippur will be joking. But Shmini Atzeret is the obscure holiday. Right at the very end of the time. That's what's really important. Because that's what's really important. So all the holidays heavily counted as over. It's simply ridiculous. You counted down days. They don't do anymore? Okay. Of course, you have to have so much time on so everything becomes heavily infused. You ever seen a plane on Shavuot? On Shavuot? You see a plane on Shavuot studying? Yeah, well, that's some Kabbalistic. Why? Because the entire process, right, by receiving the Torah again, studying, so you get a completely so far as imagine, it's like a nice cycle it spirals up, right? From here, cycle. So folks, this is the major thing of the Zohar. They can read the Zohar so not balancing of the zero idea of I don't think all kinds of conversion very, very attractive. We're 190 years out, 200 years out from the Muhammad in 1492. The already on for Jews to convert. As you can imagine, from wealthy Jewish doctors, wealthy Jewish poets, wealthy Jewish rabbis who's had a lot of pressure to convert. If he's a Maimonidean and believes in really a metaphor, a Jewish law metaphor, you're going to stick your neck out for a bunch of metaphors. If Jesus and God and Moses, they all kind of come out the same in the wash, you get to keep your job and flourish, get new lands, you best believe. They converted not because they hated their religion, but because they were educated enough, or perhaps too much, that they can say, look, I can still worship my God inwardly, I can still believe in all the things I believe in, and I can pray in church. Because praying in church gives me a title, gives me a title. So why not convert? Zohar says they should mess up all the reality. That's why. Stupid, dangerous, bad shit. That's the very thing that the big way that God engineered reality was that he reverse engineered and correct following the Torah, understand the objects, and to unreason for the commandments. The commandments in the Torah are not random. They're not. Honor the Sabbath on this day, not when God says do this, do this. God's not telling you something. God's telling you that this is just a roadmap for piety. This is how you fix the world. And not only that, God's telling you not just to follow these rules because you should follow them. God's telling you to follow the rules because God followed them. God kept Shabbat. God puts on the calendar. God puts on the talent. God does everything that you're supposed to do. The task is not for you to do a bunch of rules. It's for you to follow the rules because God does those rules. And insofar as God does those rules in the creators of the perfect world, and it's only by doing that, only by following the Jewish law scrupulously, especially the rules that make no sense, only by following those rules that make no sense, have any chance at all of balancing out the world that is wrote. The only way the world would fit is Jews being servant. So again, to drive this point home, Kabbalah is not liberal, hippy-dippy. Kabbalah is the most radically, legally conservative you can imagine. And why? Because the esoteric meaning in its books is that they are actually part of the reconstruction, renovation of the world. The renovation of the world to the reparation of the world. It's only by following the Jewish law scrupulously as possible, especially the parts that don't make any sense, is that accomplishment. So, in the same way that God created the world, He mandated the various holidays, not just you doing things, Rosh Hashanah, or these are divinely mandated temporal structures in which one can correct the world in a very specific way at a very specific time. You can't correct it at any other day of the year. You have special powers that day. And the Zohar loves very minor holidays. Sometimes they travel to Israel, they ask you what a Jewish holiday is, trying to weed out moralers. Right? Trying to weed out people. Well, I always wanted to mess with them, right? And say, yeah, my favorite holiday is Sarah. The most obscure holiday is Shemini and Sarah is the most important holiday. So we know more important holiday. Yom Kippur, but Shemini and Sarah is a completely obscure holiday. Right at the very end of the holiday. That was God's specific way. Because that's what's going to be important to the right? So all the holidays is heavily mystical mean, the counting of the omen, something that seems completely ridiculous. You're counting down the days to bring us. Yeah. Oh, yeah. The counting of the omen is incredibly important. If you're not counting out the omen, you're counting out some Torah. So you play the entire process. So everything becomes heavily imbued. You ever stayed up late on Shavuot? You ever done a tikkun on Shavuot? Stayed up late on Shavuot studying? Well, nothing Kabbalistic. Why? Because the entire process, right, is like receiving Torah again, studying, receive it again. So you get a completely simple period of time. So far, and that's how we choose from right? It's from here. Cycle to eventually reach the world of the divine. Through the process of the rectification of the divine to the law, the world produces. Now, this gets liberalized in our modern conception, right? Because the first time I'm saying that make the world a better place. The Kabbalists do not imagine what makes this world a better place. It's the idea of this world metaphysically, ontologically. That idea is found deeply. So folks, these are the major things of the Zohar. The Zohar tends to work over and over and over. It's like it's like jazz. They're gonna take these things and play them over and over and over. Things throughout the life of the recording these things. And so the Sefirot, Shekhinah, balancing of the Sefirot, the idea of Achra, evil, and the idea of Torah. So these big things that dominate the literary text and the big sacred Zohar. What we're going to pick up with next is how this is true. Just appears. People are like, yeah, that's it. That's the roadmap for the recreation of all beings. This book, and this dude is Spank. It's more skeptical, and we'll talk about how this became true, how this went from being a collection of texts in the late 13th century of Spain becoming basically the cornerstone of Jewish theology. I'm pretty sure you've never heard any aspect of Jewish theology. There's something coming out of the sacred Zohar. So we're going to do next time, we're going to think about how the sacred Zohar was received, and we're going to begin discussing Gloria and Kabbalah. Because one of the big things that Gloria and Kabbalah is part of the systematization of the Zohar. The Zohar is not a systematic text by any stretch of the imagination. It is again, it's very different. It's not systematic. So what ends up happening is, again, so we have a couple different versions of systematizing, and what ends up happening. Definitive systematizing is going to be Gloria. So we'll talk about that process of systematization, that process of canonization, and why it became decanonized. Next time we transition to what I would call the Zohar and the system. Welcome back.
Go fuck yourself.